Hi, I want to take you back some 2,000 years to the time when Jesus walked upon this earth to give you a glimpse of events that are depicted in my soon-to-be published novel, Ears to Hear. This takes place in an inn in the city of Damascus, where Sabbath services are held for some who had never been to a Sabbath service in their lives, and several people share how God has radically transformed their lives. Jairus was nervous when he stood to read before these people whom he had never met in his life, and he had not been sure of what to read. He had rummaged through the scrolls that were at the inn and found a tattered copy of the prophecy of Daniel. And so this morning, he read for them the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when he had finished, he said, "The Son of God, who walked with the young men in the fiery furnace, walks among us today." When Jairus had seated himself, Arturo stood, and taking his cue from the story Jairus had read, he said, "I was King Nebuchadnezzar. Some of you are offended that a Roman soldier would be allowed to speak before you today, and I need to assure you that I am no longer that Roman soldier. I do not simply mean that I have retired from my service to Caesar, although I have done that, but I have shifted my devotion. When we first came to Roman Syria, my son and I were intrigued by the ancient scriptures of the Jewish people, and we read stories like the one my friend Jairus read for you this morning, and we came to believe in the God who created the heavens and the earth. As a Roman soldier, I was trained to be arrogant, and I marched across the land with the sneer of command upon my lips. And so I was quite surprised by the manner and demeanor of Jesus when he began to speak. And of course, we recognized a connection between Jesus and the ancient scriptures and the living God. We were amazed at what he taught and what he did. We even observed as Jesus touched a leper and cleansed him of his leprosy. And we became convinced that Jesus held the authority of life and death. When Arturo had sat down, Jairus stood again, but before he could move to the front, his wife stood beside him and spoke. He nodded, and together they stepped before the people, and Jairus said, "My wife Dorcas has asked to speak to you, and to be very honest, she has more to say than I." Jairus started to sit down, but Dorcas clung to him. So he stood beside her as she began to share. I was the wife of a prominent citizen in our city, and I was a participant and was under all the restrictions of my people. But when Jesus began to teach in Galilee, oh, the scriptures came alive for us. He spoke 3 times in the synagogue where my husband was ruler, and we heard him several times as he taught along the sea, and saw him heal many, many people. But the day came when a plague struck Capernaum and all of Galilee. It began at Fort Tiberias, and hundreds of soldiers, many of them with their families, died. And it struck our own home. I would have preferred that it had taken me or even my husband, but it took our daughter Eve. She was paralyzed and lay in bed crying out in pain. I sat by her side night and day, but there was nothing I could do. On about the 3rd day, I said to my husband, Jairus, go find Jesus. He is our daughter's only hope. He had been thinking the same thing and left quickly, but we did not know where Jesus was teaching, and it took time to find him, and time was something we did not have. That evening, Eve died. That was the very worst day of my whole life. I suppose I was fortunate that there were people there with me. Wives of the synagogue leadership were helping me and trying to minister to her, and they comforted me as best they could. They sent for mourners, which is our custom. One of them helped me wash her cold, lifeless body to prepare for burial. They even stayed the night with me, and the next morning they sent a delegation to find my husband. They found him, and he had already found Jesus, and they were coming. But of course it was too late, and they said, do not trouble the master anymore. Eve is gone. They did not know what else to say, but Jesus encouraged my husband. Don't be afraid, he said, only believe, and she will be well. They came to our house, and Jesus came in, and of course the women and mourners and others were there, and he said to them, why are you weeping? She's not dead, asleep. And some of them laughed at her. We all knew she was dead. But he put them out of the house and took my husband and me into the room where her body lay. He took her hand and looked at her. At this, Eve jumped from her seat and ran to her mother. Throwing her arms around her, they wept together, as did everyone in the inn. It took Dorcas some time to regain her composure so she could finish the story. Jesus said, little girl, arise. And Eve sat up. The spirit had returned to her, and she stood and walked around, and Jesus told us to give her something to eat. And we can honestly say our lives have been changed beyond compare by the power of God in His Son, Jesus the Messiah. When they had seated, Ananias stood before the people, motioning for Jairus to stand with him. And yes, Jairus was still a little reluctant, especially at this time, to stand there. For our Ananias did a question and answer time in these services. He began, as he usually did. Most of you are familiar with this question and answer time. It is done to teach you about the ancient scriptures and help you understand how Jesus shines through them. If I cannot answer your question, or I think one of my answers is incomplete, I will study with all of my heart and come back to you and give you a better answer. Who has a question? He asked. A man was already standing before Ananias had finished what he had to say. And agitated, he began to say, I know that this question and answer time is supposed to be about the Torah. And I believe that is good, but I have to ask. We have to ask this question. I am so pleased that the husband of the lady who shared is standing with you. I have heard a number of stories of Jesus raising the dead, but this is the first time I've heard from someone who was actually involved. And I have to ask, we have to ask, who can do this? Who can raise the dead? More specifically, who is this Jesus?